Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Today we have Professor Tim Noakes, and I gotta say I was so excited to interview such a highly respected and world-renowned scientist and researcher. He has published more than 750 scientific books and articles. He has been cited more than 16,000 times in scientific literature and has been rated an A1 scientist for a second 5-year term. He founded the Noakes Foundation, which does critical research on these new dietary approaches and helps underserved communities eat better. He's changing millions of people's lives in South Africa and the world as one of the biggest voices in the low-carb, high-fat movement. Please listen to his story because it's very important. He was in great shape his whole life as an ultra-endurance athlete and marathoner, yet still developed type 2 diabetes. You can be thin and fit and still be damaging your body with a high-carb diet that athletes believe is necessary. So take a listen to his words of wisdom. Also, pre-order a copy of Food Lies on Indiegogo.com and see the trailer and other rewards. The link is in the show notes. We need your support to finish the film. I want to thank everyone who's contributed so far. We've had such an awesome group of people contribute. I'm getting so many stories of how people changed their diet and changed their life. They're also saying they can't wait until the film is made so they can share it with family, friends, and coworkers so they can get the correct information so they can do the same themselves. So thanks, and here we go. Professor Tim Noakes, it's truly an honor to talk to you today. You've contributed so much to the world with your research and books and foundation and speaking events and being really a worldwide leader in this movement. So thank you.
It's a pleasure, Brian, and thank you for having me on your show.
All right. Well, I had an idea that we could learn about your life and interesting story while also getting an overview of what the hell happened to America and the world basically over the same time period. So you grew up in South Africa and must have been born around in the 1950s when this all started.
I was born in Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, as it was then. It's now Harare, Zimbabwe, in 1949. My parents had immigrated from Britain at the end of the Second World War. And interestingly, my dad had two options. He was either going to the southern states of the United States or he was going to Southern Rhodesia. And he couldn't get a green card, so he went to Rhodesia. I must admit he was involved in the tobacco industry, so that I carry that weight of that on my shoulders. But he always said that he hadn't done any good for anyone, which wasn't quite true. And he said, it's up to you to make good. So I've kind of maybe been inspired by that. So I grew up in Southern Rhodesia, and at the age of 5, we moved to Cape Town. And I've been in Cape Town, South Africa ever since. I did my high school training, I did my medical training here, and then I did all my research career. I must just add that one of the great years of my life was spent in Southern California, in Los Angeles, as a high school exchange student at the Huntington Park High School. It was the most amazing year of my life, and that was 1967-68, which was the year that everything changed in the world, and not least in the United States. And that had a huge impact on the rest of my career for many reasons, which we won't go into, but it was... So I owe a lot to Los Angeles. And of course, I went to the beach where you are. So I knew a little bit about that, but as I said, I had a fantastic year. So anyway, I came back from America and decided I better study medicine because when I was in the US, I didn't have a clue what I was going to do. But Professor Christian Barnard did the first human heart transplant at my university, Cape Town University. And I figured, well, if he could do that and be so successful, maybe I should try medicine. Not a very good reason to study medicine, but anyway, that's how it started. And the other point about being in Los Angeles was my best friend in Los Angeles on the last day, the day we graduated, he told me as soon as he went to university, he was going to start rowing, i.e. crew. And I thought, that's a really good idea. I think I'll do that. And so I started rowing when I came back to Cape Town. And that taught me so much. And then I started running as a result. And then, of course, I became sort of very knowledgeable about running and made it part of my life. So again, that was another good reason why Los Angeles was so helpful to me.
Yeah.
So the end result was that when I got into first year medicine, and particularly second year, because then we did physiology, and it turned out physiology was what really attracted me. I always wanted to understand how things work. And it was when I was studying physiology in second year, I realized, no, this is what I want to do for my life. And so for the rest of my career as a student in medicine, I was always interested in the preventive side of medicine and the sports medicine side. And I couldn't stand the treatment side of medicine. I couldn't understand why you had to give people medications to make them healthy. And I literally never learned anything about pharmaceutical drugs. I just fooled my examiners. I mean, I think I was a huge risk to get past me as a medical doctor. But so anyway, it was very clear what my interest was. My interest was research and it was sport. And so when I graduated, I did my internship. And then very next year, 1976, I started on my career as a scientist and I did my PhD in medicine. And it was during that year, 76, 77, that the new US dietary guidelines came out. It was also that time that I was now running a lot and I was studying the physiology of running, and it was all carbohydrates. You had to eat carbohydrates because they made you a faster runner. And I was working in a cardiology unit. And the guys were saying, well, you mustn't eat fat because that'll kill you from heart disease and so on. And when you're 27 and your boss, who's a world authority, tells you that, you don't question it just by chance. You don't question it. So I inherited this theory that fat is bad for you and that it's going to kill your arteries and so on. And I followed that for 33 years. And then I wrote this monumental book called Law of Running, which has been ranked the 9th greatest book ever in running. And so it's affected a lot of people's lives. And what does it say there? You must eat lots of carbohydrate to run faster. And of course, for it, we did huge amounts of research, but it was all carbohydrate based. And I was getting money from industry to do the research. So you unwittingly, without realizing it, you're hugely biased towards doing studies that will prove that carbohydrates work. And I remember how difficult it was for us to actually prove that the carbohydrates work. But that didn't deter us. We carried on. Then we were the first people to do a placebo-controlled trial of carbohydrate loading. And by placebo-controlled, it means that the experiment was such that in one leg of the experiment, the people loaded on carbohydrates. And on the other part of the experiment, they loaded on what they thought were carbohydrates but weren't. They tasted like carbohydrates, but they were a sweetener which didn't have any calories in it. And then they had to cycle for 100 kilometers in the laboratory. And at the end, there was no difference in performance. And I couldn't believe it, because carbohydrate loading is going to make you faster.
Yeah.
So when I wrote it up, I said essentially that obviously the carbohydrate loading should work, but it didn't work because X, Y, and Z. And we gave other reason. And which is astonishing because you're not allowed to do that in research. That's a post hoc interpretation. Our hypothesis was that the carbohydrates would work, and they didn't work. Therefore, they don't work. Anyway, but that kind of didn't get through my mind at the time. So anyway, we advance a few more years, and we get to 2012, December 2010. And I finished a book called Waterlogged, which was an expose of the fact that you don't really need lots of fluids during running, and I'm not sure you need the sugar either. And it was a very taxing book because it put me in conflict with all the scientists working on carbohydrates during exercise and water during exercise, and particularly the American College of Sports Medicine. They didn't take kindly to what I was saying because it conflicted with their guidelines. And then I exposed the fact that their guidelines were drawn up by people who, like me, had been completely dependent for our funding on the industry. So obviously we were going to find in favor of the industry, the product.
So wouldn't that be sports drinks, or was that someone else at that time?
Yeah, it was a sports drinks, and it was, of course, the big one in the US, which we won't mention names, but if you read the book,
everyone knows.
Everyone knows if you read the book. So anyway, on the 12th of December, 2010, I finished this monumental manuscript. It had taken 30 years of work, not writing the book, but the whole volume of work was 30 years, and I sent it off to the publishers, Human Kinetics, in the US. And I woke up the next morning and my brain said, you must go for a run at 6 o'clock this morning, and you must run for the rest of your life, you see. Because I'd been writing so much, I hadn't been running enough, and my running was dreadful at the time. So I went out and ran, and I had this shocking run. And I came up this little hill just at the back of our house, and I felt like I'd reached the summit of Mount Everest. I felt so bad. But then I figured something's got to give, you see, and I was a number of kilos overweight. And I thought, but how can I lose weight? I mean, I've tried everything and it doesn't work. So by chance, I literally opened my emails and there was an advert for the book, The New Atkins for the New You, written by Westman, Finney, and Volek. And I was so angry because it said the new Atkins. And I said, but Atkins was the killer who told us to eat saturated fat, etc. I was so angry. I got in the car and I drove to buy the book because I was convinced that they'd sold out to industry. So anyway, I bought the book and my face just dropped because I saw, oh my gosh, I got it all wrong. These guys are right. There's all this evidence for low carbohydrate diets. And everything that the symptoms that I'm expressing in my own body is exactly what they describe here. I've got insulin resistance and I'm getting diabetic. So I decided then and there, that's it. My last carbohydrate has been eaten. And so by lunchtime, I changed my diet. And within days, I started to feel better. And within 6 weeks, my running had just gone back 20 years. It went back to being a 40-year-old compared to being a 60-year-old. And I felt absolutely rejuvenated. It was absolutely astonishing. And so I never looked back. That was amazing. And then sometime thereafter, I eventually decided, well, I better check if I'm diabetic or so on. And I discovered I was diabetic. And then I decided, okay, well, let's see how the low-carb diet works on this one. And I probably waited another 3 months or so. And then I decided, actually, I've still got a high HbA1c and my fasting glucose is still elevated. It was still substantially elevated at that time. Now I better go onto medication. So I went on to metformin, which is obviously a glucose-lowering drug. And I've been on that treatment now for 7 years. And the exciting bit is that in the last 2 months, my results have come back showing that I'm essentially a diabetic in remission. I'm not cured because if I was starting eating carbs again, I'd get the disease back again. But I've got glucose control as good as 99% of South Africans my age or better. So I'm very excited. So great. Yeah. And for me, it was really interesting because it took so long. It took 7 years. And what really made a big difference was starting to do weight training in the last 6 months and intensive gym work with CrossFit. And that seems to have made a big difference because I put on 5 kilograms of muscle in my upper body. And that seems to have just made a huge difference. So I'm really very excited. So the long and the story short of it is I followed the dietary guidelines. I ate lots of carbohydrate. I told the world to eat lots of carbohydrate. I developed type 2 diabetes, and I've been able to reverse that with a high-fat diet and lots of exercise. And I'm really excited that I've been able to do that. When I announced that I had diabetes, everyone said, oh, it's because you changed to a high-fat diet, you see. So they just ignored the 33 years of the high-carbohydrate diet that I'd eaten.
Yeah, and it's so obvious now looking back and all that you've researched, I know that you understand it more. So there's so many things that I want to go back into. So I guess the first thing is just you challenging your own beliefs the whole time. And so just with waterlogged, there's certain beliefs that we have to be drinking tons of water, and maybe that's not true. And then your beliefs in high carb diet, that's the only way to go. And even with Westman, Finney, and Volek, who wrote The New Atkins for a New You, I know that you respected them as researchers. I mean, they were top researchers in their field. So that must have been some cognitive dissonance for you when just always just challenging beliefs. And it's so great that you've done that. And I saw you on a film rip out the pages of your book that set all the high carbohydrate pages and told everyone, rip them out. This is wrong. So how does that work with challenging your beliefs?
It's funny. It was never a problem for me. And I think I get it from my father that, he set out from Great Britain to Zimbabwe without a penny and set up a new life in a new country at the end of the Second World War. And that took huge courage. And he was a very successful businessman because he said, I just challenged everything what was normal and I just did the opposite and was successful. And I think that was it. But you talk about the waterlogged. Well, with waterlogged, it was very simple. I saw the black swan, what we call a black swan. A lady collapsed during the Comrades Marathon and nearly died. And everyone thought she's dehydrated, gave her fluids, and she just made her worse. And when she wrote to me and I looked into it, it took me about 2 months to realize, no, it's the opposite. She had drunk too much fluid and she nearly killed herself as a result. And so then we did the definitive research and could show that we were absolutely right. I have faith in my intuition. I've been right now 7 times. 7 times I've tried different ideas and 7 times I've been right. It's just that I have the intuition that this is not right what we're doing. once you start researching it, that's the other thing is I just go back into the research and I read everything that's ever been written on the topic. And then it's very obvious that you see the trends, and we've obviously forgotten stuff, and that's why we make the errors.
Hasn't there been 14 deaths due to overhydration?
A minimum, an absolute minimum. There've been more than that. I think in waterlogged, we probably got up to about 14. But since then, I know there have been a couple more that have been reported in football players, particularly young football players in the United States. And the military recruits also, they're always a problem.
Yeah. So I guess the thing is, I mean, I never even considered that would be a problem. It seems universal. Everyone's just drink water, drink water, drink water. But it's just always about challenging beliefs and making sure that the research is there. And it's pretty simple where it's just your bodily instincts to drink when you're thirsty. And you probably don't need to do something that goes beyond your instincts, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, what we've done with humans is we've made out that we're very weak and we have to be told consciously what to do. And that's nonsense. I think I was fortunate to start running in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was no knowledge and there was no marketing and there was no science, so-called science behind it. And we just did what other people had done, the experts before us had done. And we followed instinct and did what our bodies told us. And I followed George Sheehan. He said, listen to your body, it'll always tell you. And it always did. But what industry has done, both in my profession and in sport, is to try to make out that humans are weak. In fact, we're incredibly strong people, a race of people. To have survived what we've been through over the last 3 million years, we're incredibly successful. Our bodies are designed to cope with stress and duress and so on, as long as you get the right diet, of course. But that's the point. The body is incredibly powerful and strong. And we've just made it so weak and saying you always got to have more water or more carbohydrates to survive. Well, humans have survived for millions of years without all that nonsense.
And I think people naturally have these instincts to eat what's healthy for them. And I've heard it in so many stories of vegans that ruin their health. And they had this instinct they just wanted meat, but they kept suppressing that and trying to do the right thing, supposedly that they thought was right. And then when they finally went back, they had this deep desire for milk fat or for tuna or for just a piece of meat. And everything in their whole body was leading them to that. And when they finally ate it, they felt amazing. And it was just coursing through their body. And they knew they were doing the right thing and was on the right path ever since.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. I've read lots of those sorts of stories.
So also one thing I want to go back to is your father actually had type 2 diabetes.
That's correct. And he died from it. And this was very inspirational for me in a negative way or in a positive way, as you see it, because he was diagnosed with diabetes at 68 and I'm now 68 and he lived a further 10 years, which means that, and I've had my diagnosis for 7 years. And I've probably had diabetes for longer than that. So by rights, I should be dead from diabetes in a year or two's time. That's why I just had 10 years to sort it out, to find out what I was going to do with it. And I think fortunately I discovered Westman and Finney and Volek and made the right choices and so could get rid of the diabetes. But the reality is he didn't die of diabetes, he died of the management of diabetes. And that's the problem. If you're going to eat high carbohydrate diets, as my father was told to, and as I sort of supported him, because I didn't know any better in 1992. So he ate the high carbohydrate diet and developed all the complications, classic dreadful complications of diabetes that no one really wants. It is the most debilitating disease. What my father's death taught me was that my responsibility was to get out there and encourage people to understand that diabetes is a disease of choice. And if you choose to eat lots of carbohydrates, you will develop all the complications. Whereas if you choose to eat a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, you don't need to have any of the complications. And that has been confirmed now by the fabulous Virta Health study, also coming from California, from San Francisco, showing that diabetes can be put in remission in the majority of patients just by eating a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet.
Yeah, I love that. I love what they're doing, and I've been following them for a while. And it's so amazing that they're actually publishing research about it. So it's not just, these thousands of anecdotal stories. It's actually more formally put together.
Yeah, exactly. And I must just make another funny story because Finney and Volek, of course, are involved in Virta Health. They're key drivers of the whole thing. But in 1984, Steve Finney published the first paper showing that you could adapt to a high-fat diet. And the first person to phone me about it was a young lady called Paula Newby Fraser, who was at that time training in San Diego. She's also a Zimbabwean who had lived in South Africa, and I'd known her well and helped her with some of her training. And she came over to San Diego to become a professional triathlete. And she phoned me or wrote to me, I can't recall, probably phoned me because mail would have taken weeks in those days. And she said she just read the study. Did I think that she should go on a higher fat diet? And I said, Paula, I think that's a great idea. She then became the world's greatest triathlete of all time. She won 28 Ironman and she won 8 Kona World Championships.
Wow.
And when she retired, she came to Cape Town to see me and she said, Tim, that advice was the best advice I received in my whole career. Now, remember, this is 1984, when on the one side, I'm telling everyone they must eat as much carbohydrate as they can. And on the other side, she asked me, should I eat more fat? And she does. And then, in fact, she adopts the low-carb diet. And I said, but Paula, I never told you to eat low carbs. She said, well, that's how I interpreted it, so I did it anyway.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
A lot of runners think that. You probably have had the same thought of what would have it been like if I learned this high-fat diet 30 years ago?
Yeah, there's no question in my mind because my running was best early on, 1972, 1973, which was before I'd really bought into the high carbohydrate story. And I was still eating a lot of meat and a lot of protein. And that's because that's what I was brought up in. In Zimbabwe, you eat meat all day, every day. And that's why Paula Newby Fraser, she said, but I grew up on meat. We used to eat jerky, and we call that biltong. She said I was eating it all the time. So that and then she even ate that jerky during the Ironman. Mm-hmm. So you're quite right. And my running was much better. And then it got worse. And I put on weight and I couldn't understand why. Why am I suddenly putting on all this weight? And that was the reason I was eating all these carbs. Now, the guy I converted to the high carb diet was Bruce Fordyce, who won 9 Comrades marathons. And I then converted him back about 4 years ago because he was also insulin resistant, put on a lot of weight. I mean, a little weight, 10 kilos or so. And he went on the high-fat diet, and he said eventually he started racing again, and he ran a sub-3-hour marathon at 56 on the diet. And he's the greatest runner in South Africa ever, and particularly in ultra marathons. He said, Tim, if only I'd followed this diet when I was racing, I would have won a few more races.
Yeah. Well, okay, so here's something. This kind of flies in the face of what a lot of people, especially here in America, believe. Because around the Olympics with Michael Phelps, there's all these stories of him eating 10 pizzas and 10, burgers and pasta and eating 12,000 calories a day. So people still have this idea that that's what you need as an athlete. And I think it's really important to reiterate that you were an athlete yourself. You were running a lot and you still were gaining weight and you were still getting type 2 diabetes and you were still thin for much of the time. A lot of these athletes are thin and they look like they're in pretty good shape, but they're doing damage to their body internally from all the carbs. And so what's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's the problem I had, obviously. So I was profoundly insulin resistant. And I went back on data we'd collected on myself during experiments when I was 28. And my fasting insulin was 5 to 8 times normal when I was eating a high carb diet. So we were studying low carb and high carb diets at that time. And it was remarkable. I mean, it was so clear that I was profoundly insulin resistant. But of course, we didn't know what it meant. Because there was this high insulin, but we're eating a high carbohydrate diet. And then when we eat a high fat diet, the insulin was much more normal. It still wasn't quite normal. And in fact, during the whole day, because we were doing day-long experiments, it still didn't reach normal values. So my point was I was lean, I was running marathons, I was training a lot, and I still had this profound insulin resistance. And then over the next 33 years, I just ate so much carbohydrate that eventually the system said, okay, it collapses and you have type 2 diabetes.
Can you explain insulin resistance for a second? Because for new people, it doesn't sound like it's that bad, or they may not know what that even means.
So the majority of Americans are insulin resistant. Now, we know that. And if you look at people at a young age, it might be difficult to see it. But insulin resistance means that you can't metabolize carbohydrates normally. So every time you take in carbohydrate, whether you're healthy or not, you have to secrete some insulin. But if you're insulin resistant, you have to over-secrete this hormone insulin to get the glucose out of the system. Because essentially humans are not really designed to have naked glucose in the bloodstream and coming in from the gut. We weren't designed to get our energy that way. And so insulin is this crisis molecule which takes the glucose out of the system before it can damage you. And it dumps the carbohydrate in the liver or in the muscles and makes you burn it at the same time. But all that carbohydrate must be got rid of in a very short time, within, let's say, an hour and a half or 2 hours after eating. And if you're insulin resistant, you have to secrete more insulin to get rid of the carbohydrate. But the problem is, the more insulin you secrete, the more insulin resistant you become. In other words, it becomes more and more difficult to get rid of all that carbohydrate. And the insulin has a lot of other effects. And we think that all the chronic diseases we see today, from cancer to dementia to obesity, are all linked to having too much repeated bouts of this high insulin. And so what happens is, when you're 20 or 30 or 40, you're fine. You're still not fat. You still can produce enough insulin and it still works. But around about 45 or so, the insulin, now you can't produce enough and it doesn't work anymore. And then you become obese and develop type 2 diabetes, or the complications like high blood pressure, cancer, even dementia, but later on. So we think all those diseases are linked to this insulin resistance problem. And where I was wrong in writing my book, Law of Running, and why I tried to tell people I got it wrong, was because if you're going to eat this high carbohydrate diet, do it for 5 years, but then stop, please, because it's going to cause damage in the long term. And I'm really great to speak to Dave Scott, the other great Ironman triathlete, also a Californian. And I spoke to him like about a year ago, and he said, Tim, he'd been a high carb athlete when he won 6 Ironman. And he said he realized that was wrong. And 4 years ago, he converted to the high-fat diet. He said, I won't allow my athletes to train on a high-carb diet. So how big a conversion could that be? One of the greats of the sport, together now with Paula, they both learn you can't eat the carbs for many years. They're going to harm you. So it's really important, the point you're making, that if you're eating a high-carbohydrate diet and you're still thin, that doesn't mean to say you're not going to pick up problems in the next 10 or 15 years and, like me, develop type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure people understand that. And even if you're not an athlete, a lot of people I talk to when I'm making this film, I end up talking about it a lot. And people are like, hey, yeah, I do fine. I eat carbs and I'm in great shape. And I say yes. I mean, not a lot, but maybe, a quarter of the population can do fine on carbs, but not everyone can. And 2, that it may catch up with you someday. And this may just be, you don't know exactly what damage you're doing.
Yeah, that's correct. I absolutely agree with that. And so people need to know what their level of insulin resistance is. And I was chatting to the students this evening, the medical students, and telling them that, as doctors, you better know what your level of insulin resistance is, because you're going to try and be treating patients, and you have to be the example of how you manage this condition.
Yeah, it's hard though. Not all doctors do these tests. Even I was actually at the doctor yesterday trying to get my blood work done finally to make sure I was on the right track. And, like you said, if I'm doing this movie, I should be an example of doing the right thing. And they didn't really want to give me the test. And they said, hey, you look fine. And, we don't really do the insulin resistant test much. And it was a weird experience.
Yeah, that is so surprising, because it's California, as I say, 50% of California is insulin resistant that we know of. And that's not even looking at properly examining the population. So every second person's likely to be insulin resistant. If you ignore it, you're just going to develop a diabetic population.
Yeah, we just really need to change this whole system. And I think we're kind of on the right track. I think people are starting to understand this stuff more and more. And we're moving away from the low-fat, high-carb recommendations. I actually was filming for the movie, and I was in a grocery store, and I couldn't find a lot of low-fat products anymore. The messaging has changed, and I was so happy about that, because I didn't even realize that. Because usually I don't ever go in the middle aisles of the grocery store. I don't buy any packaged foods, so I don't know what the messaging is these days. But I was so happy to see it was a lot about protein and not any low-fat messaging.
Well, that's great. That's a great change. But, California always leads the world. So whatever's happening there is going to percolate to the rest of the world in time. And so it's good to see it's happening already there.
Yeah, maybe it's just because I'm in West LA, like cool Whole Foods, California, and everyone's a little bit up with the times. Why don't we get into some other misconceptions too? Sort of back to the dietary guidelines of what we got wrong. So maybe I'll just ask questions like an average person who doesn't really know much about this stuff. Like, why should I use full fat cream in coffee instead of skim milk?
Because once you take the fat out, you take all the vitamins and you take out the real nutrients that you need. That's the first point. Second point is the key to eating is to satiate yourself. And you satiate yourself by eating enough protein and fat. And the easiest way to eat properly, eat enough protein and enough fat, is to eat fat-filled produce like dairy. So to take out the fat from the milk just doesn't make sense. It's taking out the nutrients you really need.
Yeah, I actually was just reading the Weston A. Price book finally and talked about a young boy who was eating only white bread and skim milk and was dying. And all he told the mother was just give him full fat milk. And he gave him some whole bread and was immediately back to health. Yeah,
exactly. And a lot of the problem is that if you don't take fat in the diet, you can't absorb all the nutrients from the diet. And that's one of the problems. But the key variable is that you need fat in the diet, and you need it to make up at least 50% of your diet, in my view. And again, the satiety is a big issue. The reason why the low-carb diet is so successful is because it satiates people. And then they can stop eating rubbish because they focus on the really good foods, the nutrient-dense foods. Small amounts of nutrient-dense food and you lose weight dramatically.
Yeah, that's definitely the recurring theme that everyone I've talked to, all these great experts, is that you just want to focus on nutrient density. The rest is just filler. If you're eating anything with just some carbs and junk in it, or especially processed foods, you're really just taking away from the important parts and just getting extra calories and extra filler and the worst kind of calories.
Exactly.
So here's another one. So won't I die of heart disease if I eat a bunch of saturated fat from red meat?
No, you'll die from heart disease by eating a bunch of carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates and vegetable oils. So I always tell audiences, listen, please, you've got to get the cholesterol out of your head and replace it with insulin resistance and insulin as the cause of arterial disease. And I think that's really will be shown in due course. There never was any evidence that cholesterol is the cause of arterial disease. All the evidence is that diabetes is the cause of arterial disease, and that the risk factors for heart disease are all the insulin resistance factors. So it's going to take time, but the evidence is that. And I quote chapter and verse, but one has to read Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, because she destroys the argument that a low-fat diet is healthy. It's not. The low-fat diet has caused the obesity diabetes epidemic. It has caused arterial disease of the worst kind. And that's the diabetic arterial disease that my father died from. That is caused by the low-fat diet, and it is prevented by the low-carbohydrate diet.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was one of the first books I read, and everyone should read it. And yes, I'm interviewing her maybe in Ohio at the conference where you'll be at.
Fantastic. She's just awesome. She's just amazing.
Yes. And I know we'll get to her in a second because she was part of your trial. So part of the problem with this diet heart hypothesis that fat is the cause of heart disease is that it seems so obvious. And you open up an artery post-mortem and there's all this junk in it and fat, then you think, oh, well, this stuff there's cholesterol and fat blocking the arteries, so it makes sense that it's eating it. But it's actually the carbohydrate that's causing the inflammation. It's a bit different. So
yeah, exactly. And I could quote some really interesting studies, but the one that I'm really enjoying at the moment was published 3 weeks ago, because we're always told that the definitive proof that cholesterol causes arterial disease is people with familial hypercholesterolemia. In other words, they have familial cholesterol levels which are enormously elevated, 3, 4, 5 times normal, and they supposedly die young. Well, the reality is that some die young, but the majority live a normal life expectancy, which you're never told. But this study was the one study the pharmaceutical industry should never have done because they didn't know what the outcome was. And anyway, they took a group of 200 people with familial hypercholesterolemia, and they randomized the one group to use the most potent statin cholesterol-lowering drug they could find, and the other 100 just did what they normally did. And the difference at the end was that the cholesterol was 50% lower in the group treated, and the prevalence of major cardiovascular events was reduced by, 0.46 of a single percentage. 0.46 of a percentage, meaning there was no difference. So the benefit was zero. And it turns out in medicine, we use a thing called the number needed to treat. That tells you how effective a treatment is. So you had to treat 217 people with massively high cholesterol. You had to drop it by half for one to benefit and 216 to see no benefit whatsoever. Now, anyone who tells me that the lipid hypothesis is alive after that study, which is a definitive test, is corrupted. They just don't see the facts.
Yeah, it's crazy. And even very low cholesterol actually shows more deaths,
Correct.
Right? If it's too low.
Correct. And I'm at the age of 65, and the higher your cholesterol at my age, the less likely you are to get cancer or dementia. So I'm very happy that my cholesterol's nice and high.
Yeah, that's good to hear. So here's the next one. I thought we should be eating a bunch of heart-healthy grains.
Well, where did the word heart healthy come from? So there have been a number of trials, randomized controlled trials of the kind I've just discussed with you, except this one, they would give people grains or not grains, and not one of them has shown any benefit whatsoever. So there never was any proof that cereals and grains are healthy for us. But we were forced to eat them because your US government decided that they wanted to smother the world in grains. So that's what they did. And our health suffered as a consequence.
Yeah, it's such an oxymoron, heart healthy grain. And it's just so crazy that, is it the American Heart Association that puts those labels on cereals that has that heart healthy stamp?
And the American Diabetes Association as well. Yeah.
It's absolutely ridiculous. So, okay, so yet related. So people will say, oh, but whole grains have to be good for me, right? I mean, maybe for some people who can tolerate them, but I mean, whole grains still hit your blood sugar in almost the same way.
Exactly. Well, actually, a whole grain is indigestible. Why did not ancient civilizations, but why did civilization spend so much time pounding the grains and refined? Because you can't digest it. If you had a real whole grain, you wouldn't digest it. It can't be digested. So the term whole grains is nonsensical. It's meaningless. Humans cannot digest whole grains. So what are they talking about? I don't know what they're talking about.
You don't even, it'll just pass through you without even your body being able to access any nutrients that might be in there. And that leads to fiber, right? So fiber has been sold to us for so long when it seems like we don't actually need fiber.
Exactly. And again, the clinical trials that have been done have never shown any benefit for fiber, even for constipation. Remarkably, when you cut out, the only clinical trial I'm aware of found that when people cut out the fiber, their constipation resolved, which is the opposite of what we taught. So it's really interesting. Our understanding of fiber has been driven by Mr. Kellogg's since the 1800s, the late 1800s. He said it was good for us, and he was wrong. He never had any evidence. He was just selling a product and a religious belief, a Seventh-day Adventist belief in the value of plant-based diets.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole story in itself. I'm going to try to get maybe Gary Fettke or someone else to go deeper into that. Yeah, I found that story really interesting about how we even got onto this whole meat demonization and plant-based diet is supposedly healthy. It just doesn't make sense to me. For all of human history, animal products have been the most highly prized parts of our diet. And I don't know how we got away from that. And even before around 1959, it was common knowledge that carbohydrates made you fat. Right? There's all these old ads, showing us as much. So I feel like for all of human history, and even up until maybe 1959, we kind of did have the right idea. So what happened?
Yeah, it was the US Dietary Guidelines, American Heart Association, and Ansel Keys who promoted the saturated fat story. So he had a religious belief in saturated fat being dangerous, and he made sure he got the evidence to prove it. But of course, the evidence was selected and it was wrong. And we now know it was dreadfully wrong. It was exactly the opposite, that we shouldn't have been doing what he suggested.
It's so crazy. We'll probably have people talk more about this story, but really the simplest way to break it down is around this time, there was two competing theories, and it was basically Yudkin versus Keys. And Yudkin had the correct idea. He was a British guy and saw that whenever a civilization was westernized with sugar and refined grains, they got fat and sick. So his whole idea was that it was causing the heart disease and obesity. And really, it was almost like a popularity contest that Ansel Keys ended up winning. And therefore, we went down this path for the past 60 years.
Precisely. And the key point, of course, was that Ansel Keys had the sugar industry behind him, whereas Yudkin had the sugar industry attacking him. And he lost all his funding. He was demonized. He eventually stopped doing academic research. But that was all coordinated by the sugar industry, and they've been doing it ever since. And
Exactly.
that's partly the reason why the saturated fat story has been so successful. There was no one to attack it, whereas there were plenty of industrial interests to make sure that sugar was never exposed as the real cause of the problem.
Yeah. And there was, a big New York Times article exposing all this and, actually showing who was paid off. These Harvard scientists were paid off by the sugar industry. So this is all recorded that this happened.
And, it's just so funny because Nina Teicholz wrote to me just 2 days ago, and that turns out the British organization is about to release its own guidelines. And they still say you've got to keep saturated fat below 10% of the diet, for which there is no evidence. And it turns out that there were 3 people on the committee, all of whom funded by Unilever, all famous scientists, 2 of them from Harvard, and nutritional epidemiologists. And nutritional epidemiology is a nonsense science. It is not a science.
No.
They're holding the world up to ransom still because it's the Unilever, the polyunsaturated fats are still telling us we can't eat saturated fat when there is absolutely no evidence.
It's crazy. And if people don't know, Unilever is, a giant company that makes probably half the products in your kitchen or bathroom.
Yeah, most of the polyunsaturated fats and a lot of the ice cream as well, just to get on both sides of the story.
Yeah.
They're promoting sugar and polyunsaturated fats.
Well, they're just trying to make money. And part of this is you can't blame them. I don't think there's some huge conspiracy theory for all of history. There was some paying for some of it, definitely sugar industry actually paying scientists, but a lot of it was just big business taking advantage of the situation where the government's giving us guidelines, low fat is good and carbs are fine. Sugar is just an empty calorie. So they just responded and they're like, oh, we'll make Snackwell's cookies and we'll make all these low fat products. And they just jumped at the opportunity. So it's not like there was, every single thing was some conspiracy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just business. And we need to make that point that it's not a conspiracy theory. It's the way the world works.
Exactly. So here's a conspiracy theory. Someone may have colluded to sort of entrap you on Twitter and cause this. So if people don't know, Professor Noakes has been in an ongoing trial for years and years that, finally came to an end. But why don't you talk about that and start from the beginning?
Yeah, in 2013, we released this book called Real Meal Revolution, which caused a real revolution in this country because what happened was people started eating a low-carb diet and they found they lost weight and they became healthy. And then they went to the dietitians and the dietitian said, you can't eat that diet, it'll kill you, it'll raise your cholesterol, etc. But they said, but hold on, I'm curing my diabetes, I'm curing this, that, and the other. How can you say that? And the dietitians had no answer. And as a consequence, there was a huge concern that the profession would go into disarray. And who could they blame? They could blame me. So we have evidence that on a particular day in January, late January 2014, the head of the Dietetics Association in South Africa contacted a lady who was on the board of the Health Professionals Council of South Africa and said, Noakes is a problem. The Health Professions Council must do something about it. And she received an email back saying, we have a plan for Noakes. And a few days later, I tweeted something, and they then used that tweet as the excuse to charge me for gross unprofessional conduct. And that case has been ongoing for 4 years. And I tweeted 7 words. Key is to wean baby onto low-carb, high-fat diet. That was it. And for that, I got prosecuted for disgraceful conduct. So the key was that the prosecution in the case was never about the tweet. It was about showing Noakes up and proving that he's a quack and proving that the low-carb diet is dangerous. The only problem was that what they did was they managed to also subvert the process. So I should have been given all the evidence they had against me and all the evidence that a low-carb diet is dangerous, but I was never given that. I was charged and put before this jury or committee without ever being allowed to make my case. So when I realized I was going to be prosecuted in this most vile way, because it was a trial, although it's meant to be just a hearing and you're meant to have independent people are meant to come in and say, well, he's right about this, but he's wrong about that. That never happened. The whole goal was a trial to expose me in the low-carb diet. So fortunately, I had some brilliant lawyers, 2 of them who gave their time for me for free. And they said, Tim, you just kill them with science. And that's what we did. So we presented 12 days of testimony, including 3.5 days of cross-examination for me and another half day for cross-examination of the 3 expert witnesses. And they could only find one tiny error we made in those 12 days, one tiny error. I just mixed up gestational age on the one slide, and I misinterpreted the slide, but it meant absolutely nothing because the slide still said what I said it. So that was the only error. So what happened then was it was a scientific dispute about whether the low-carb diet's safe or not. And the Health Professional Council, which should be independent, which should say, well, let's hear both sides, they chose to side with the dietitians. And the dietitian they chose to side with has a master's degree. She's in private practice. She's got a massive conflict of interest. And then I'm an A1 rated scientist in nutrition science and exercise science. And there aren't too many of us around and in this country. But the Health Professional Council chose to support her and put me through this 4-year prosecution. The trial ended April last year, and we got a 10-0 ruling. In other words, everything that was contested, we won. But the Health Professional Council is in charge, so they decide they're going to appeal the decision of their own committee. I mean, it's astonishing. So they form another committee, and we went to court in February. And then they said we'd have the result by March, but now, of course, it's May. We still haven't had the result. And this Friday, the final report comes out, and hopefully that'll be the end of it. But it's been pretty tough, but we survived. And it became quite a cause célèbre around the world. And we wrote a book called Law of Nutrition, which describes the whole 7 years of this witch hunt and explains exactly how unethical so many people acted against me. So many professionals in this country acted completely unprofessionally.
Yes. I've been following this trial as well for a year, and it's really crazy that people are just so interested in their own careers and their own livelihood that they're willing to go to these lengths. And in some level, you could say it makes sense. They're scared because they're wrong. I mean, this whole dietitian world is based on the wrong information. So of course they're scared as it's finally coming to light with all this new research that they are wrong.
No, exactly. And, we've had so much support. In South Africa, there was a vote held after the end of the trial, and we had 7,000 votes to 700. So we were winning 10-1. And there was a petition launched in the United States, and we have 41,000 signatories saying that this is ridiculous and they should just stop the trial. And a lot of those people were doctors and scientists. So there's huge interest, and there will be huge interest in the outcome. And if we win it cleanly, we will win in the long term. I mean, if they decide to try and fudge the story, we'll take them to the High Court, where we will win absolutely so convincingly, and we will expose all the shenanigans behind what happened. So I don't want to do that because there's a lot of people going to be very, very embarrassed by what we expose. But if we win it, the world is watching, and they're going to say, oh, you see, Noakes said eat a low-carb diet, and they said it's fine. That means the low-carb diet's fine. That's what the outcome will very likely be for dietitians. They're going to have to start adopting the low-carb diet.
Yeah, and you have such worldwide support. It's great. And, Nina Teitschultz and Zoe Harcombe were 2 of your expert witnesses. Both have been supporting this film. And I had a great podcast with Zoe. So love what she's doing. And
they're 2 very special ladies. They're 2 special. They're very, very astute, and they completely destroyed the prosecutor. He actually didn't cross-examine Nina because she was just too good for him, and he didn't even.
He was intimidated. That's so awesome. I mean, at some point, the evidence is going to be so overwhelming that people are going to have to listen.
I must tell you, there's another funny story. So it turns out that in the last 2 years of the trial, the prosecution's lead lawyer lost a lot of weight. He looked like he lost 20 kilograms to me. And there was some story he might be pre-diabetic or have type 2 diabetes. So by the end of the trial in August this year, by February this year, he was looking amazing. So he went from the slob to looking really good. And at the end of the trial, now when it's all finished, he comes up to me and he says, thanks, Prof. He said, I've lost quite a lot of weight, and you taught me a huge amount of medicine that I didn't know.
That's so funny. Also, I heard another funny story. I heard that a lot of these people on the other side were, eating these sugary treats and whatnot, and were dead tired by the afternoon. And your side and your lawyers were totally fine and eating the high protein and fat diet could run all day.
Yeah, exactly. And the lead prosecutor was also seen to be sort of snoozing sometimes in the afternoons. And I think that's why he didn't cross-examine Nina, because he just wasn't in an emotional state, or he was too carb loaded to think.
Yeah, that's so great. So I guess just to recap that one tweet that you even sent, it's really funny to me that you were just telling the mother, for one, you didn't have a doctor-patient relationship, right? That was one of their big points that they tried to initially attack you with, but you were just giving general advice on Twitter, which is basically just free speech and not a doctor-patient relationship. And two, you were just saying basically to go eat real foods, and that your country's own recommendations were those same real foods.
Exactly. And the World Health Organization are exactly those same rules. And it turns out South Africa has a massive stunting problem for children. And the way you stop stunting is by getting children to eat animal produce. That's clearly shown. There's no question about that. So all I said was exactly the South African dietary guidelines for infant feeding or infant weaning, exactly as they are written. So how can you charge a guy, even if it was in a doctor-patient relationship, how can you charge him for saying what is true? The funny thing was that by the end of the trial, the prosecution was saying, no, it doesn't matter that there wasn't a doctor-patient relationship. You are giving information that is dangerous for millions and trillions of people around the world. And I mean, that was eventually what the trial came down to, that you can't give information to these people because they're so stupid. They're just going to follow it immediately, or going to die, drop dead tomorrow. Or their children are going to die because they're in ketosis or something. I mean, it is utterly ludicrous. Again, the point being that humans are clever. The mother who tweeted, we know she had a doctor, she had an obstetrician. Any advice I gave to her, if it was advice, if it was medical information or whatever it was, she would go to the doctor and she'd say, well, Dr. Noakes, he says this on Twitter. What do you think? She's not just going to follow it because I said it. And in fact, the irony was she didn't follow it. She said it's ridiculous. Who's ever going to raise their children that way?
Yeah, it's so crazy. I guess we could move on. After the trial, what's going on with you? What is your normal life like?
Well, it's trying to get back to normality, I guess, because the emotional strain of this thing has been astonishing on my wife and myself. Because, for a good period of 2 years, I just woke up in the morning and I was thinking about this ruddy trial and preparing material to present. So it completely dominated our lives. And it's taken us a year to get back to more normality. And so in the last year, we wrote the book, or last year and a half, we wrote the book Law of Nutrition, which has been published. And thank goodness we're going to get an American publisher as well, so it can be more easily available in America. We're currently in discussions with people. So that was really worthwhile. And it was, if I hadn't gone through the trial, a number of things wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't understand the topic as well as I do. We wouldn't have written this book. The world wouldn't have seen this whole catastrophe for what it really is. And it's really helped us advertise the value of the low carbohydrate diet. In the same time, in the 4 years, if you think how far we've moved with the low carb diet, it's absolutely astonishing how far we've gone. The evidence that's accumulating by the day, literally by the day, is astonishing. The Virta Health study came out a few months ago. Then their study showing very much improved cardiovascular markers. Then Monday came out David Ludwig's study showing that type 1 diabetic children and adults do very well on this diet and report very low HbA1cs as a consequence of being on the diet, indicating that their glucose control is, as he said, superb. And so this can't be ignored anymore. And so we're moving so rapidly now that we're approaching that tipping point where people will just say, we have to accept this. In South Africa, in a sense, we've gone past that tipping point because I founded the Noakes Foundation. And one of the things we realized was doctors want information. So we did set up a nutrition network, which we launched a week ago, May the 1st, which has been oversubscribed numerous times. It's astonishing. And this is doctors who just want the evidence. They just want the information. Why? Because their patients are coming in and saying, I'm doing this low-carb diet. It's amazing. My glucose is better. My blood pressure is lower. And the doctors now have to say, gosh, we support you. And they need to know how to support them. So that's the one thing that we're focusing on, is that educating doctors. We've got a whole bunch of research projects, and I personally will start writing more stuff. I'm I have to revise the law of running because I got to take out all the carbs out of it and put the fat into it. But also the key to the law of running is that it starts with an analysis of how do you improve your performance, and it was all about carbohydrates and training and so on. And now I know it's about training the brain. So that the first few chapters will be how the brain regulates exercise performance. And so we'll push carbohydrates into the background by a long way. So I'm going to be writing that book and starting that. It's a major rewrite, a major job to undertake.
That's so great. And I know you're kind of famous for popularizing that theory of the brain controls your exercise. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, when I started in the exercise sciences, we were taught that the muscles produce too much lactic acid and that inhibits your performance and you have to slow down. And for a number of reasons, over a period of about 20 years, I realized that can't be true because very simple experiments that we did and simple observations. For example, if you watch the great runners, they speed up in the last lap of the 10,000 meters. How can they do that if the muscles are poisoned by lactic acid and that's what's causing them to slow down before? How can they suddenly speed up? So then we eventually realized that the brain regulates performance in anticipation so that you get to the finish without dying. And we call that the central governor model of exercise. And today, my most recent PhD has just been awarded his PhD, and he's taken it to the next level to show how control of pain is also part of the component that the brain uses to control your performance during exercise. So that's the central governor model, and that the new book will start with a deposition of the central governor model.
That's so cool. And since the book won't be talking about high carb anymore, it will be talking about running on fat. So I guess, talk about fat adaptation for a second.
Yeah, well, some of the work we're doing now is looking at fat-adapted athletes and showing that their metabolism is completely different than athletes who are adapted to high carbohydrates. And I'm not going to tell you all the ways because I don't want to give the story away quite yet. But all the textbooks are written on how the body of a carbohydrate-adapted athlete adapts to carbohydrate. When you have a fat-adapted athlete and you give them carbohydrates, they respond totally differently. And that's really exciting. So it tells us that the metabolism is completely different and that people who are carbohydrate adapted absolutely have to have the carbohydrates to keep going. And they are metabolically crippled. And the idea that you're metabolically crippled if you're a fat adapted is nonsense because you can burn enormous amounts of fat. But when you need to burn the carbohydrate, you can burn the carbohydrate as well. So you've got this huge capacity for prolonged exercise, but you can still continue to do your high intensity exercise. Whereas, as I've indicated, if you're a high carbohydrate athlete, you just have to keep feeding yourselves carbohydrate during marathons and ultra marathons. And I think that one of the great adaptations to being a high fat athlete is that you can run without needing to worry about replacing your energy during the exercise. Whereas if you carbohydrate, you have to worry, where's the carbohydrate coming from?
Yeah, there's so many stories of these people who they call it bonking, or you're constantly eating these little sugary gel packs. And if you don't get them, you're going to not be able to finish the race. And there's so many examples of people doing ultra marathons. People are doing 100-mile races. They don't really need any food. They're doing these bike rides up hills. They don't need anything. I mean, maybe after like 5 hours, they'll drink coconut oil or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's the truth. That's the reality. And it makes such a difference. And again, every day I receive those reports as well. And it's easy to explain because your body is designed to burn fat. Your body is designed to store fat. We have so much fat in the body, we can run for 4 days without eating if you're just burning fat. But if you're burning carbohydrates, in 2 hours, you're done. You've got to now replace the carbohydrates, or you burn fat at a very slow rate because you're not properly adapted to it.
It seems like almost everyone should be fat adapted. This isn't just for marathoners. I finally researched this and took the plunge and got myself fat adapted. And I was always fine in general. Like I could tolerate carbs pretty well, but I just got to a whole new level when I switched over my body metabolism, and everything has been better in my life. And I feel amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what's also good about being fat adapted is not having to count calories on this diet. And I think your book, The Real Meal Revolution, is so awesome. And it's taking South Africa by storm and letting people know that this is a better way to eat. And I think it's great that so many people are adopting it, right?
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a book we wrote in about 5 weeks. It's astonishing how successful it's been. It's one of the most successful books in the history of South African publishing. And it's just one of those books that just happens and you think you can repeat it, but you can't. It was the right book at the right time.
Yeah, it's awesome. And there's online free resources too that I've used. So anyone can find it if you just search Real Meal Revolution, and they have an awesome food guide and, easy to understand like what I should be eating and what I shouldn't be eating. So you're starting a movement. It's going worldwide. What do you think would happen if the whole world went on this high-fat, low-carb diet?
Well, we'd prevent diabetes and we'd prevent obesity, and people would be so energetic. And I think that's what frustrates me, is that it's such a life-changing event when you go into this diet and you realize that what you thought was aging is simply not. It's just the diet that you're eating. And you just feel so much better and healthier and energetic and more positive and able to exercise better and recover more quickly and train harder. It's just so amazing that I look around and I see all these people and obese and struggling, and I think, if only you'd listen to me and just change and cut out the processed foods and cut out the carbohydrates. It's easy and your life will change.
And it's delicious. And yes, I agree. I mean, other than making this film, one of the only other things I'm working on is I'm working with a doctor, Evolve Healthcare here in LA, to make a program similar to Virta. I mean, they're doing such amazing things up there in the Bay Area. I mean, I kind of want to, just borrow what they're doing and just make it available to more people down here.
Exactly. Exactly. And particularly the poorer people. That's key in this country, because it's the poorest people. I know East Los Angeles, I saw a fabulous report on East Los Angeles and diabetes rates there and how it's just swamped by high carbohydrates and cola drinks and so on.
Yeah. And it just starts with the information. And, I want to get this information across in the film. And then, hopefully I can get this healthcare plan, maybe using some technology like Virta does, to help people learn about this and stick to it and manage diabetes and obviously reverse it. If people don't know what Virta is doing, they are reversing type 2 diabetes, getting people off all their medications. It's so amazing.
Absolutely. Precisely. Yeah.
Congrats to them. And thank you so much for doing all that you do. Everyone should support the Noakes Foundation. It's the noakesfoundation.org. You can donate there. I believe, a lot of your profits from your books go straight to the foundation. Yeah,
that's correct. I have always given all the proceeds of my books to various of my different charities, as it were. And so this is no different. And one of the key foci of the Noakes Foundation is to get poorer people eating more healthily. And that's because we know that they're the ones who really need the help. And they live in an environment where the food is too terrible, and we have to change the food that they're exposed to.
Yes, exactly. So yes, please, everyone, support him, the foundation, find him on Twitter. Any other place you want to send people?
Yeah, the Noakes Foundation website would be a nice place to hear about what the foundation is doing.
Okay, great. Go there. And thank you so much for everything you do. And I hope everyone learned a lot today.
Thanks, Brian. It was a privilege to be with you and to your audience. Let's keep driving this process and change the world for the better.
All right. That's good words to go out on. Thank you, Professor Noakes. All right, everyone. Here's that time when I talk about crowdfunding again. Instead of taking on sponsors to interrupt this podcast or taking on outside funding for the film, we're doing all this on our own. So please support us and we'll get that perfect film made. Search for us on Indiegogo or follow us on Twitter @foodlies.org and Instagram @food.lies. See you next time.